Every society wants to believe its money is real. We look at the notes in our wallets, the balances in our bank accounts, and we assume they are tied to something solid, something permanent. For centuries, that something was gold. Heavy, glittering, resistant to time, it was the ultimate anchor for trust. But in August 1971, on a quiet Sunday evening, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and severed that anchor. He declared that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. The world's reserve currency, the bedrock of the international system, was suddenly floating free, backed not by precious metal, but by government decree. Most Americans didn't fully grasp what had just happened. The speech was framed as a technical adjustment, necessary to protect stability. But in reality, it was a financial revolution. For the first time in history, every major currency in the world became pure fiat, money created by governments, not tied to any commodity, existing only because we believe in it. That night changed everything. Trade, inflation, debt, global power. And yet the strangest part is how little attention we give it today. Because once money lost its anchor, it gained something else: fragility. And the lesson of history is simple. When money is only trust, collapse is never far away. To understand Nixon's decision, we have to go back to the ashes of World War II. In 1944, with much of Europe and Asia in ruins, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a small New Hampshire town called Bretton Woods. Their task was to design a financial system that would prevent another Great Depression, stabilize trade, and rebuild economies. The system they created put the US dollar at the center. Why? Because the United States held the majority of the world's gold reserves, more than 20,000 tons stacked in Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. It was elegant. Dollars were as good as gold, and gold was the guarantee behind the dollar. Trust was restored, trade resumed, and the global economy began its post-war boom. For Americans, it was a golden age. The U.S. controlled 2/3 of global gold, its factories churned out goods for a hungry world, and its currency became the medium of global exchange. Foreign central banks could hold dollars with the confidence that they could be converted into gold at any time. But this system contained a flaw, one that French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later call the exorbitant privilege. The U.S. could print dollars, spend beyond its means, and run deficits, while other countries were required to accept them as good as gold. As long as trust held, it was an extraordinary advantage. But trust, as history always shows, is fragile. By the 1960s, the cracks were widening. The U.S. was spending heavily, not just on domestic programs like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but on the costly war in Vietnam. Dollars poured out across the world, financing imports, bases, and military campaigns. At the same time, Europe and Japan had rebuilt. Their economies were growing rapidly, their exports surging. This meant that U.S. dollars were accumulating in foreign central banks. But America's gold reserves were not keeping pace. The imbalance was clear. By the late 1960s, there were far more dollars circulating abroad than the U.S. had gold to redeem them. If foreign governments all demanded gold at once, the treasury would run dry. Some countries noticed the danger. France under President Charles de Gaulle was especially vocal. De Gaulle denounced the dollar's privilege, arguing that America was exporting inflation to the rest of the world. In a dramatic gesture, he even sent French warships to New York Harbor to physically retrieve gold bars from the Federal Reserve. Other nations followed quietly. Germany, Switzerland, and others began to convert their dollar holdings into gold. Each transaction drained Fort Knox further. By 1971, U.S. gold reserves had fallen by more than half from their post-war peak. The illusion was breaking. The world's reserve currency was wobbling, and confidence was slipping away. Nixon and his advisors faced an impossible choice: either tighten America's spending, risking recession and political backlash, or change the rules of the game entirely. On the evening of August 15, 1971, Nixon made his choice. Speaking from the White House in a televised address, he announced a package of measures he called the New Economic Policy. Among them was a 90-day wage and price freeze to fight inflation, a 10% import surcharge to protect American industry, and, most consequentially, the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold. He framed it as a temporary emergency action, blaming international speculators for attacking the dollar. But behind the rhetoric, the truth was stark. The United States could no longer maintain the promise of gold. The system of Bretton Woods was dead. The world woke up the next day to a new reality. Foreign central banks could no longer demand gold for their dollars. The anchor was gone. The dollar was now fiat, backed only by the word of the U.S. government. And because every other currency was tied to the dollar, the entire global financial system shifted in a single stroke. Markets reeled. Allies were stunned. Some accused Nixon of defaulting on America's promises, but there was no turning back. Within 2 years, major currencies began to float freely against each other. Gold was demonetized. The age of the gold standard was over. What followed was not stability, but turbulence. The 1970s would be marked by stagflation, the toxic mix of stagnant growth and rising prices. Oil shocks compounded the crisis. Trust in money, once anchored to metal, now depended entirely on governments and central banks. The fallout of Nixon's decision rippled through every layer of the economy. For ordinary Americans, the most immediate effect was inflation. Prices climbed rapidly in the 1970s, eroding savings and sparking social unrest. $1 in 1971 bought far more than $1 in 1981, a vivid demonstration of fiat fragility. For global trade, the consequences were even more profound. The dollar, once tied to gold, now floated against other currencies. Exchange rates became volatile, subject to speculation and political maneuvering. International companies faced new risks. Governments scrambled to manage their currencies. And yet, paradoxically, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency didn't collapse. In fact, it solidified. Why? Because even without gold, the U.S. had something no other country could match: the world's largest economy, deep financial markets, and unparalleled military power. Trust in the dollar shifted from metal to might. The new era was one of fiat money, currencies backed only by government decree. This made new tools possible. Central banks could expand money supply without limit. Governments could run larger deficits, and financial markets could explode in size. But the costs were real. Inflation cycles, debt explosions, and asset bubbles became recurring features of the global economy. Nixon's temporary suspension of gold convertibility has lasted more than 50 years. The entire modern financial system rests on that decision. But history suggests that systems built only on trust eventually face their breaking point. Look closely at the crises of the past half-century, and you'll see Nixon's shadow. In 2008, when the housing bubble collapsed, the Federal Reserve printed trillions to stabilize banks, something impossible under a gold standard. In 2020, during the pandemic, governments around the world created unprecedented amounts of fiat money to keep economies alive. The result was inflation that continues to ripple through global markets today. Meanwhile, the U.S. national debt has soared past $30 trillion. Under gold, such deficits would have been unthinkable. Under fiat, they are routine. And just as in the 1960s, foreign nations are beginning to question the system. China and Russia have increased their gold reserves. Discussions of alternative reserve currencies, from the euro to digital currencies, resurface with every crisis. The trust that sustains fiat is never absolute. The lesson of 1971 is that when trust is strained, collapse can happen suddenly. Nixon's decision was not planned years in advance. It was a Sunday night decree that changed the world overnight. That fragility remains. So what lessons can we draw from Nixon's ending of the gold standard? 1. Money is not reality. It is trust, and that trust can be broken with a single decision. 2. Privilege breeds vulnerability. The U.S. enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of the dollar's dominance, but its very advantage created the temptation to overspend, leading to crisis. 3. Collapse is both risk and opportunity. The end of gold devastated savers in the 1970s, but it also enabled new financial innovations, new markets, and new winners. Every collapse transfers wealth, The question is whether you are on the giving or the receiving end. And here is the chilling paradox. The gold standard feels like ancient history, yet every dollar, euro, yen, or pound you hold today rests on the same fragile foundation Nixon created in 1971. Fiat money lasts only as long as belief does. The next shock may not come from gold, but from debt, inflation, or digital disruption. And when it arrives, it will remind us of the same lesson history has been teaching for centuries. Trust is the only anchor money has, and trust can vanish overnight. So the question is not whether the system will be tested, it's whether you are prepared when it breaks. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe for more. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same.